Well, hello and welcome back to our journey through the Psalms and Theo faith. Today we'll be in Psalm 73. Just got back from a week in Dallas with my daughter, moving from Oak Cliff to Melissa, Texas, a growing community north of Dallas. And I'm glad to be home. It was an exhausting time moving in 100-degree heat and high humidity. Glad to be back in the cool of the mountains of Colorado for sure. So today, that's just an update for me. We're in the Psalms today, Psalm 73. Notice in your Bible and mine as well, this is labeled as Book 3 of Psalms of the Psalms. You know, the Psalms are organized into 5 different books, and we're halfway through. Psalm 75 will be our halfway point. Um, when you look at the Psalms as a whole, you'll see not only are they organized into 5 separate books, but each of those books ends with a what's called a doxology or an outburst of praise for God. Look at verse 19, for example, in Psalm 72. Let me scroll up there. So this is a doxology. Blessed be his glorious name forever, and may the whole earth be filled with his glory. Each of the books ends with a doxology like this. And this kind of indicates to us that there's been an editor involved. There's been what I'd say, an inspired editor of the Psalms that chooses which Psalms to include in this book of the Bible and how to organize them. So that's what they're doing. There's lots of Psalms. We see Psalms throughout the Old Testament. Some we don't see in the book of Psalms, so we know that there were a lot of them. So, since there is an editor, a lot of theories on how the editor chose the Psalms and organized them in the book of Psalms to tell a story. It's not just a collection of hymns like our hymn books at churches, but the conviction among most scholars and most readers of the Psalms is that they're trying to tell a story. And that story varies. Some believe that it was a explanation of the failure of the Davidic kings. The Davidic kingship ended, and there needed to be an explanation about why God's promise wasn't fulfilled. So some explain it as the failure of the Davidic kings. Others see this as a response to the crisis of the Assyrian invasion in 509 BC in the northern kingdom. So the 10 northern tribes were carried off into captivity, created a huge theological problem in Israel. So some understand this to be an explanation of what happened, what's gone on, what is the explanation of this crisis. Still others look at this and they say, there's 5 books of the Pentateuch: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. 5 books in the Psalms. There seems to be some similarity there. Perhaps the psalmist, the inspired editor, collected these to reflect what we see in those first 5 books of the Pentateuch. Finally, the view I subscribe to, and I've come to this kind of late, actually, in my preparation for teaching the Psalms this year. I've come across this theory that the Psalms are both descriptive and predictive of Israel in the end times. So, what we see reflected in the Psalms is organization that's categorized by events that are going to happen according to the prophets, especially Ezekiel and Zechariah, this sequence of events in the last days, specifically an ingathering of Israel under their messianic king, then a gathering of the hostile nations to Israel. The messianic king dies then, he's slain, and Israel is exiled. And then finally, Israel is regathered and the nations are routed. And the Psalms end with what's called the Songs of Ascent, which is the songs of nations assembling and ascending to Jerusalem to worship during the Feast of Succoth, the booths, which Zechariah talks about. So that's my view on how these are organized. When we come into this section here, we see that this is a book that's about.
Something went wrong. Please try again.
Oh, sorry. Siri's talking to me. But this is a psalm, and this book is a series of psalms about the judgment of the unrighteous. So perhaps judgment on unrighteous nations and even unrighteous Israel. We'll see that later on. We're going to see in Psalm 83 and 84 even a judgment against unrighteous supernatural beings. So that's the theme here. Israel being regathered, the nations judged. Psalm 73 is a psalm I've titled Almost. This is a psalm by Asaph. Asaph's one of the men that David designated as a choir director. And like all music, it teaches something. The words here teach something, and maybe we can catch that as we go through this. Again, I've called this psalm Almost because it's a psalm about almost stumbling into envy, almost stumbling into envying what other people, the rich, the prosperous, have. The way that envy works, it begins with a thought in our mind, like all sin. It begins there in our mind. And then pretty soon it affects our emotions. And then finally, it affects our will. So envy leads you ultimately to doubt God, to doubt his goodness, to doubt what he's doing, and then to focus on the things that apparently are withheld from you, things that God holds back, or you believe God holds back. And then ultimately you turn away from God in order to pursue those things that you're envious about. And that's what almost happens to Asaph here. That's what almost happens to the psalmist. And perhaps that's what almost happened to Israel. And they had to be pulled back and they had to be reminded. So, as you go through this psalm, make note of that and make note of the apparently enviable things that the wicked enjoy. I've highlighted some of them here in the first part of the psalm. They seem from a distance to enjoy prosperity. They have no pains in their death. Their body is fat. And at this time, a fat body meant that you were prosperous, you were rich, you had more than you needed. It wasn't a stigma as it is today sometimes, but it was a sign of health and wealth. They're not in trouble as other men. They seem to be able to get out of trouble, seem to escape. They're not plagued. I think they're talking about here disease. Pride is their necklace. They take great pride in themselves. They get away with violence and they use violence to protect themselves. Fatness, again, they're so fat their eyes are bulging out of their sockets. Their imagination runs riot. I mean, anything they can think of, they pursue it. They're arrogant. They speak from on high, speak against the heavens. Their tongue parades through the earth. Isn't that great imagery? Well, that's what we see here at the psalmist is looking at. And he almost comes to the point where he wants these things as well. And then in our here verse 17, we see the psalmist goes that route until a particular place. So let's take a look at this. First, let's highlight and explain what this says. Just phrase by phrase or word by word. Until is kind of a turning point, a chronological marker, right? I did this until it becomes an end point, in this case, a turning point. Asaph, again, tempted to envy and emulate the apparently rich and prosperous up to this point. And then what happens is Asaph goes into the sanctuary of the Lord. Well, the sanctuary in Asaph's day was that portable tabernacle that was constructed in the middle part of the book of Exodus, carried throughout the wilderness wanderings, and was finally replaced by a temple in Solomon's reign. So all during David's reign, it was just this tent, a portable sanctuary. And it was a place where that was appointed by God where people could meet with him. So this was the place that you wanted to go in order to meet with God. So Asaph came into that place, came into the presence of God, and perceived their end. Now, in my Bible, when that's italicized, it means the editors have added that word just to smooth out the reading. So then I perceived their end. That is, at that point, he perceived their end. Perceived means to be to consider or to reflect on something or discern something. And it seems like what he's saying here is once Asaph was in the presence of God, he was able to understand the eternal ramifications of the lifestyle of those he envied and where his envying would take him, where emulating the rich and prosperous would take him. So I'm going to apply this to ourselves in our time, or I'd call it our dispensation, this time of the church. We don't need a specific place to be in the transforming presence of the Lord. Our place to be in his presence is oftentimes the time of prayer. It's where we meet with him. It's where we have some focused time with him. I'm aware of, so-called arrow prayers and things, but there should be times in our lives where we set aside 10 minutes, 15 minutes, an hour or more just to pray and focus on the Lord. And at these times, part of our prayer practice should be to consider our desires and do that frankly, as the psalmist does here. Frankly consider the desires that you have, the aspirations and the goals that you are harboring in your heart, and look at them from God's point of view. Look at them from an eternal perspective. We need to take the time, I think, daily to consider and then anticipate the final outcome of our way of life. One of my seminary professors, Roy Zuck, some of you may recognize that name, he had a very picturesque and impactful way of saying this. He said that every day a man should look into his own grave. I think that's really what the psalmist is experiencing here. He's looking into his own grave and he's considering the end of envy and pursuing the things that he thinks are important. So in terms of response, let me just ask you a few questions that perhaps you can ask yourself as you're in prayer today. Are you pursuing things of eternal significance? Do you even have the aspiration to pursue the things of eternal significance? Are you taking time out during the day to just enjoy God, just to be in his presence, to take, again, 10, 15 minutes, half an hour or more, to just be in the presence of God, be in the presence of his word, and to reflect on all that he has done for you, both spiritually and materially in your life? Maybe you should ask yourself, are you investing yourself and your wealth in what's eternal and what's going to last? I pray, brothers and sisters, that you are not like the prosperous who waste their time. Let me just add a caveat here. I'm not saying that all prosperous people squander their time. I'm not saying that all prosperous people are wasting their time on frivolous things. But I am saying it happens. And I am saying that we need to go into the presence of the Lord, into our prayer closets, into our some quiet area, and just reflect on our lives and ask ourselves these questions. Are we pursuing things of eternal significance? If not, what needs to change? God bless you, brothers and sisters. See you next time in Psalm 74.